It was a busy Friday evening at the Golden Leaf, one of the most prestigious restaurants in downtown Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the white tablecloths and polished silverware, while the gentle murmur of conversation filled the air. Among the bustling waitstaff was James Chen, a 25-year-old graduate student who had been working at the restaurant for the past 8 months to make ends meet. James moved quietly between tables, his black vest pressed perfectly and his dark hair neatly combed. Unlike some of his coworkers who dreamed of becoming actors or musicians, James had a different aspiration. He was pursuing his master's degree in music education, hoping to one day teach children the joy of music that he had discovered in his own childhood. The main entrance doors swung open, and Patricia Wellington made her grand entrance. She was a well-known figure in New York's social circles, not just for her wealth, but also for her reputation of treating service workers with barely concealed disdain. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer dress spoke of old money, while her sharp eyes constantly searched for imperfections in everything and everyone around her. "Mrs. Wellington," the maitre d' greeted her with a slight bow. "Your usual table is ready." Patricia nodded curtly and led her group of 4 equally well-dressed friends to the best table in the house, positioned near the grand piano that served as the restaurant's centerpiece. The piano, a magnificent Steinway & Sons, stood silent most evenings, used only during special events. James, who had been assigned to their section, approached the table with practiced professionalism. "Good evening, ladies. Welcome to the Golden Leaf. May I start you off with some drinks?" Patricia barely glanced at him as she ordered an expensive bottle of champagne. Her friends, following her lead, treated James as if he were invisible, continuing their conversation about their recent trips to Europe and their children's achievements at private schools. As James moved away to fetch their drinks, he couldn't help but overhear Patricia's loud voice. "The help these days," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "When I was young, servers knew their place. They were properly trained, properly respectful." James felt his cheeks burn, but he maintained his composure. He had dealt with difficult customers before, and this was just another Friday night. What he didn't know was that Patricia had noticed his reaction, and it had given her an idea for the evening's entertainment. When James returned with the champagne, Patricia was already formulating her plan. She watched as he skillfully opened the bottle and poured the golden liquid into their glasses without spilling a drop. His hands, she noticed, were clean and well-maintained, with long fingers that seemed more suited to an artist than a waiter. "Tell me," Patricia interrupted him mid-pour, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what do you do besides serving tables? Surely a young man like you has aspirations." James hesitated for a moment before responding politely. "I'm actually working on my master's degree, ma'am." "How fascinating," Patricia said, though her tone suggested anything but fascination. Her friends exchanged knowing looks, recognizing the familiar glint in her eye that appeared whenever she found a new target for her amusement. The evening proceeded normally for the next hour as James served their appetizers and main courses. Patricia continued to make subtle jabs at his service, finding fault with everything from the temperature of the water to the spacing between the plates. What Patricia didn't know was that every time James walked past the grand piano, his fingers itched to touch the keys. He had spent countless hours practicing on a similar model during his childhood, before his family's financial troubles had forced them to sell their own piano. Now, he could only practice on the basic keyboard in his small apartment, trying to keep his skills sharp while juggling work and studies. As the main course plates were being cleared, Patricia's eyes fell on the piano once again. A wicked smile spread across her face as she turned to her friends. "Ladies," she announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I believe it's time for some entertainment." James, who was stacking plates on his tray, froze imperceptibly. He had no idea that his ordinary Friday night shift was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would change not only his life but also Patricia Wellington's perspective forever. Patricia Wellington raised her crystal wine glass, tapping it gently with her silver spoon. The delicate sound drew attention from nearby tables, exactly as she had intended. Her 4 companions leaned in, already amused by whatever scheme their ringleader was about to unveil. "You know," Patricia announced loudly, her voice carrying across the restaurant, "this beautiful piano seems so lonely tonight. It's practically begging to be played." She turned her sharp gaze toward James, who was finishing clearing their dinner plates. "Our waiter here looks like he has pianist's hands." Don't you agree, ladies? Her friends nodded enthusiastically, catching on to her game. They had seen Patricia pull similar stunts before, always at the expense of service workers who couldn't fight back without risking their jobs. Young man, Patricia called out to James, surely you can play something for us? It would make our evening so much more memorable. The way she emphasized the last word made it clear that she expected him to embarrass himself. James stood frozen, the stack of plates still in his hands. His mind raced to the countless hours he had spent practicing piano, to the competitions he had won as a teenager, and to the old upright piano his parents had sacrificed so much to buy him. But those memories were bittersweet now. Marcus Reynolds, the restaurant manager, hurried over after noticing the commotion. He was a tall man with grain temples who always prioritized keeping wealthy customers happy. Is everything all right, Mrs. Wellington? Oh, yes, Patricia replied sweetly. We were just discussing how lovely it would be to have some music with our dessert. Your waiter here seems perfect for the task. She gestured toward James with a manicured hand. Marcus turned to James, his expression a mix of sympathy and resignation. James, perhaps you could. He began, letting the sentence hang in the air. They both knew it wasn't really a request. James carefully set down his tray of dishes. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear of playing, but from the anger and humiliation of being put on display like a circus performer. He could feel dozens of eyes on him as he walked toward the piano. This should be entertaining, one of Patricia's friends whispered, not quite quietly enough. The group suppressed their giggles as James sat down at the piano bench. The Steinway's polished surface reflected the chandelier light, and James could see his own reflection in it. He adjusted the bench with the practiced movement of someone who had done this countless times before. This small action caught Patricia's attention, making her smile falter for just a moment. Other diners had stopped their conversations, watching the scene unfold. Some looked embarrassed for James, while others seemed curious about what would happen next. A young couple at a nearby table exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly disturbed by Patricia's behavior. James took a deep breath and placed his hands on the keys. The familiar feel of cool ivory under his fingers brought back a flood of memories. His first recital at age 8, winning the state championship at 16, and a heartbreaking day they had to sell their piano to pay for his father's medical bills. Marcus stood nervously by the kitchen entrance, wondering if he should intervene. He had never heard James mention anything about playing piano, and he worried this situation would end badly for everyone involved. Patricia leaned back in her chair, wineglass in hand, ready to witness what she assumed would be an awkward fumbling of keys. Her friends mirrored her posture, their expressions eager for the entertainment they expected. The restaurant had grown quiet now, the usual dinner ambience replaced by anticipation. The weight of the moment pressed down on James, but instead of crushing him, it awakened something that had been dormant for too long. He closed his eyes briefly, deciding which piece to play. It had to be perfect, not just to prove Patricia wrong, but to honor everything the piano had meant to him throughout his life. His fingers hovered over the keys for one more second. In that moment, James made a choice. He wouldn't play something simple to just get through this humiliation. No, he would show them exactly who he was. As his fingers descended toward the keys, the restaurant held its collective breath, unaware that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne No. 20 in C-sharp minor floated through the restaurant, soft and delicate like raindrops on a quiet evening. James's fingers moved across the keys with the grace of a dancer, each note perfectly timed and weighted. The smirk on Patricia Wellington's face froze, then slowly began to fade. The piece started gently, almost hesitantly, as if the music itself was unsure whether to reveal its true nature. But as James continued playing, his confidence grew. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, and his eyes remained closed, lost in the emotion of the piece. Patricia's friends stopped their whispered conversations. Their wine glasses remained untouched on the table as they watched the waiter they had meant to humiliate transform before their eyes. One of them, Barbara, actually set down her fork with a soft clink, her half-eaten dessert forgotten. Other diners in the restaurant had stopped eating as well. The usual clatter of cutlery and murmur of conversations died away, replaced by the haunting melody that filled every corner of the room. A young woman at a corner table wiped a tear from her eye, moved by the unexpected beauty of the moment. As the piece built toward its emotional climax, James's hands danced across the keys with increasing intensity. His earlier trembling was gone, replaced by the sure movements of someone who had spent thousands of hours perfecting their craft. The piano responded to his touch as if it had been waiting all along for someone who truly understood its voice. In the kitchen, the staff had gathered at the door to watch. Even the busy chefs paused in their work, drawn by the music that had transformed their workplace into a concert hall. Marcus Reynolds, the manager, stood with his mouth slightly open, realizing that he had completely misjudged the quiet waiter who had worked for him these past months. Patricia's face had lost all trace of its earlier condescension. She sat rigid in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The music seemed to strip away her carefully constructed facade, forcing her to confront the cruelty of her intended joke. Her eyes never left James's hands as they moved across the keys with practiced precision. As the piece approached its end, James opened his eyes. The vulnerability in his expression touched everyone who could see his face. This wasn't just a performance. It was a window into his soul, revealing years of dedication, loss, and love for music that no circumstance could erase. The final notes lingered in the air like a farewell whisper. For a moment, complete silence filled the restaurant. Nobody moved, as if breaking the spell would somehow diminish the magic of what they had just witnessed. Then, from a table near the window, someone began to clap. The applause spread quickly, growing into a thunderous ovation. Several people stood up, creating a ripple effect until nearly the entire restaurant was on their feet. James remained seated at the piano, his hands now resting quietly in his lap. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths as the emotion of the moment washed over him. It had been 3 years since he had played on a proper piano, 3 years since he had performed for anyone. Patricia Wellington sat motionless in her chair, her face pale. Her friends glanced at her uncertainly, their usual synchronized behavior disrupted by the unexpected turn of events. Barbara, the one who had set down her fork earlier, had tears in her eyes. Marcus Reynolds stepped forward, his face beaming with pride and amazement. He placed a supportive hand on James's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to break the young man's trance. James stood up slowly, his legs slightly unsteady. The applause continued, accompanied now by calls for more. "Play another." Someone shouted from across the room. Other voices joined in, encouraging him to continue. James looked toward Patricia's table, not with anger or triumph, but with a quiet dignity that made her drop her gaze to her hands. He then turned to Marcus, silently asking permission. The manager nodded enthusiastically, gesturing for him to continue. As James sat back down at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys once more, everyone in the restaurant knew they were about to witness something special. The night was far from over, and the story of the waiter who became a maestro was just beginning to unfold. James's fingers touched the keys once more, this time launching into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The powerful opening chords resonated through the restaurant, making several diners gasp at their intensity. This was no longer the humble waiter they had seen moments ago. This was an artist unleashing years of suppressed passion. Phones appeared in people's hands, recording the unexpected performance. A food critic, who happened to be dining that evening, stopped typing her review of the restaurant's new menu and began filming instead. The story she would write tomorrow would be very different from what she had planned. In the kitchen, the sous chef whispered to a line cook, "I've worked with him for 8 months. Never knew he could do this." The entire kitchen staff had abandoned any pretense of working, crowding around the door to watch their colleagues' transformation. Patricia Wellington sat completely still, her face a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite process. The champagne in her glass had gone flat, untouched since James began playing. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of embarrassment that crept up her neck as she remembered her earlier behavior. As James played, sweat began to form on his brow from the intensity of the performance. Each note was delivered with precision and feeling, telling a story of triumph over adversity. The grand piano, which had stood silent and decorative for so long, sang under his touch as if awakening from a deep sleep. An elderly man in the corner dabbed at his eyes with a napkin. His wife squeezed his hand, knowing he was remembering their daughter who had once played this same piece at Carnegie Hall. Next to them, a group of young professionals who had been discussing stock markets all evening sat in reverent silence, their business talk forgotten. The restaurant's owner, Antonio Romano, emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. He stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with recognition. Before opening the Golden Leaf, he had been a concert pianist himself, and he knew talent when he heard it. He watched James with growing interest, his mind already forming plans. As the piece reached its crescendo, James' whole body moved with the music. His earlier nervousness had completely vanished, replaced by the confidence of someone who had found their true element. The piano bench creaked slightly as he leaned into particularly passionate passages. One of Patricia's friends, Barbara, turned to her and whispered, "Patricia, I think we may have made a terrible mistake," but Patricia couldn't respond. She was lost in memories of her own childhood, when her parents had forced her to give up piano lessons because they weren't practical for a young lady of her station. The other diners had become completely invested in the performance. A couple who had been arguing earlier now held hands across their table, their disagreement forgotten. Even the busboys had stopped clearing tables, standing with towels in their hands, mesmerized by the music. Marcus Reynolds, the manager, had moved to stand near Patricia's table. His earlier anxiety about the situation had been replaced by pride in his employee. He noticed several customers discreetly wiping away tears, while others simply sat with their eyes closed, letting the music wash over them. Social media notifications started pinging on phones throughout the restaurant as the videos being posted began to gather attention. The hashtag pianist waiter was already trending locally, though James remained completely unaware of his growing online fame. As the piece neared its end, James poured every ounce of emotion he had into the final passages. His fingers flew across the keys with incredible speed and accuracy, building to a conclusion that left everyone in the room breathless. The final notes rang out with such power and beauty that several people jumped in their seats. When the last note faded away, James remained still for a moment, his hands resting on the keys. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the kind of energy that comes only after experiencing something truly extraordinary. Then, once again, the applause began. This time it was immediate and unanimous, with people jumping to their feet without hesitation. Someone shouted "Bravo!" from the back of the restaurant, and others joined in with whistles and cheers. Antonio Romano stepped forward, his face beaming. He knew that this evening would change not only James's life, but also the future of the Golden Leaf itself. As he approached the piano, he carried with him an offer that would transform everything for the young musician turned waiter. Antonio Romano made his way through the applauding crowd, his eyes fixed on James. As the owner of the Golden Leaf approached the piano, the young musician stood up, suddenly remembering he was still on his shift as a waiter. But before James could step away, Antonio raised his hand to stop him. "Please," Antonio said, his Italian accent thick with emotion, "play something else for us." He turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are witnessing something special. Before I opened this restaurant, I was a concert pianist myself, and I know true talent when I hear it." James's eyes widened in surprise. In all his months working at the Golden Leaf, he had never known this about his employer. The restaurant had fallen silent again, hanging on Antonio's every word. Social media was exploding with activity. The videos of James playing had spread beyond New York, catching the attention of classical music enthusiasts and viral content creators alike. Hashtag pianist waiter had moved from local to national trending topics, though nobody in the restaurant was aware of this yet. Patricia Wellington watched the scene unfold, her usual confidence completely shattered. She felt naked under the occasional glances from other diners, who had figured out she was the one who had tried to humiliate James. Her friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier amusement replaced by shame. Back at the piano, James nodded to Antonio and began to play again. This time, he chose Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, known as the Turkish March. His fingers danced across the keys with playful precision, showing yet another side of his musical ability. The upbeat tempo brought smiles to people's faces, lifting the emotional heaviness left by the previous pieces. In the kitchen, the chef had given up on maintaining order. The entire staff gathered at the service entrance, phones out, recording their colleagues' performance. Even the dishwashers had emerged from their stations, their hands still wet from their work. A group of music students from the nearby conservatory, who had come in for a late dinner, watched with professional appreciation. One of them whispered to another, "His technique is incredible. He must have had classical training." Marcus Reynolds stood next to Antonio, both men watching James with newfound respect. The manager felt a twinge of guilt for never having asked about James's background, for seeing him as just another waiter trying to make ends meet. The performance continued to captivate everyone. A woman celebrating her birthday forgot about her untouched cake, too entranced by the music to eat. An engagement celebration at another table paused their toasts, the newly betrothed couple swaying gently to the melody. Barbara, one of Patricia's friends, finally broke away from their table. She walked to the restaurant's host station and asked for a word with the manager. When Marcus approached, she discreetly arranged to pay for James's next semester of graduate school, ensuring her name would never be mentioned. As James played the final section of the piece, his confidence had fully bloomed. His posture was different now, no longer the humble waiter, but an accomplished musician sharing his gift with the world. The chandelier lights seemed to shine brighter, casting a warm glow over the piano and its player. Antonio's mind was already working on plans. He saw not just a talented musician but an opportunity to transform his restaurant into something more. The Golden Leaf could become known not only for its excellent cuisine, but also for its exceptional musical performances. The piece ended with a flourish, and once again, the restaurant erupted in applause. This time, people were calling out requests, eager to hear more. James looked to Antonio, who nodded encouragingly. Just then, Patricia Wellington stood up abruptly. All eyes turned to her as she walked toward the piano, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. The room held its breath, wondering what she would do next. James watched her approach, his expression calm but guarded. She stopped a few feet from the piano, her usual aristocratic bearing somewhat diminished. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in years, Patricia Wellington found herself at a loss for words. What she would say next would surprise everyone in the room, including herself. Patricia Wellington stood before the piano, her hands clasped tightly together. The restaurant fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. James remained seated at the piano, his fingers resting lightly on the keys, ready to play but curious about what the woman who had tried to humiliate him would say. Patricia began, her voice unusually small. She cleared her throat and started again. I owe you an apology. The words seemed to cost her something, each one coming out with difficulty. What I did was cruel and thoughtless. I wanted to make you feel small, and instead, you showed us all what true greatness looks like. A murmur ran through the restaurant. Several people were still recording on their phones, capturing this unexpected moment of humility from someone who had never been known to apologize for anything. James nodded slowly, accepting her words but remaining silent. His silence seemed to affect Patricia more than any response could have. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her checkbook, her hands trembling slightly. Please, James said, speaking for the first time since he began playing. I don't want your money. His voice was quiet but firm. The nearby diners who could hear him straightened in their seats, impressed by his dignity. Antonio Romano stepped forward then, placing a hand on Patricia's shoulder. Perhaps, Mrs. Wellington, there is another way you can make amends. He turned to address the whole restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make. The room focused on Antonio as he continued. Starting next week, the Golden Leaf will begin hosting evening concerts. And if he accepts, he turned to James, we would be honored to have Mr. Chen as our regular pianist, performing 3 nights a week while he completes his studies. James's eyes widened in surprise. This would mean a significant pay increase, fewer hours waiting tables, and most importantly, a chance to play regularly on a magnificent piano. Patricia seized the opportunity. And I, she announced, her voice stronger now, would like to sponsor these concerts. All proceeds will go to a scholarship fund for music students who need financial assistance. She looked at James. If you'll permit me to do this? Before James could respond, the door of the restaurant burst open. A well-dressed man in his 60s hurried in, followed by a younger woman carrying a professional camera. The man made his way directly to the piano. Mr. Chen, he said, slightly out of breath, I'm Richard Blackwood from the Manhattan School of Music. One of our students showed me the videos of your performance tonight. We would very much like to discuss your future with us. The restaurant buzzed with excitement. Marcus Reynolds, who had been watching everything unfold, stepped forward. Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. He gestured toward Antonio's office. As James stood to follow them, the restaurant burst into applause again. People called out words of encouragement and congratulations. The young music students from the conservatory gave him a standing ovation. Patricia Wellington remained where she was, watching as James walked away with Antonio and Richard Blackwood. Her friends had come to stand beside her, and Barbara squeezed her arm gently. "You did the right thing, Patricia," she whispered. The other diners began sharing videos and stories on social media. The hashtag pianist waiter had evolved into hashtag pianist redemption, with people around the country following the unfolding story. In the kitchen, the staff celebrated quietly, proud of their colleague, but also aware they still had a restaurant full of guests to serve. The chef wiped his eyes with his sleeve, pretending he had been cutting onions. As James disappeared into the office with Antonio and Richard Blackwood, the restaurant gradually returned to its normal evening routine. But something had changed. The atmosphere was lighter, as if the music had cleared away old pretenses and revealed something true and beautiful underneath. Patricia returned to her table, but instead of her usual commanding presence, she sat quietly, lost in thought. She picked up her water glass with a slightly shaky hand, processing how an evening that had begun with her cruel joke had transformed into something unexpectedly meaningful. Behind the closed office door, James Chen's life was about to change forever, proof that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come disguised as ordinary evenings. Inside Antonio's office, James sat in a comfortable leather chair, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. Antonio Romano sat behind his desk while Richard Blackwood from the Manhattan School of Music leaned forward eagerly in his chair. "Mr. Chen," Richard began, "your performance tonight was extraordinary. We've reviewed your background. You were a child prodigy in California, won several state championships, but disappeared from the music scene about 3 years ago. What happened?" James took a deep breath before answering. "My father got sick. Cancer. We had to sell our piano to help pay for his treatment." He paused, collecting himself. "He passed away last year, but by then, I'd already started graduate school in education. I couldn't afford to pursue music anymore." Antonio leaned forward, his eyes kind. "And now you work here, serving tables to pay for your studies." When James nodded, Antonio shook his head. Such talent should not be hidden. Richard pulled out some papers from his briefcase. "We want to offer you a full scholarship to complete your master's degree in piano performance instead of education, plus a stipend for living expenses." He smiled. "And access to our practice rooms and instruments, of course." James stared at the papers, overwhelmed. "But my current program can be transferred," Richard assured him. "We've already spoken to the dean. They're willing to make it work." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Marcus entered with Patricia Wellington behind him. She looked different now, humbled but determined. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, "but I wanted to make sure Mr. Chen knows my offer is serious." She turned to James. "I want to establish a permanent scholarship fund in your name at the Manhattan School of Music for talented musicians facing financial hardships." The room fell silent. James looked at Patricia, seeing past her expensive clothes and careful makeup to the person underneath. Someone perhaps trying to right old wrongs. "That's very generous," James said carefully. Antonio cleared his throat. "And my offer stands as well. 3 nights a week, you'll play here. We'll work around your class schedule, of course." He smiled. The piano has been lonely too long. Outside the office, the restaurant had returned to its usual evening routine, but there was an electric energy in the air. The other servers were sharing the story with new customers who had arrived after James's performance. Social media was exploding with the videos, and local news stations had begun picking up the story. Back in the office, James looked at the scholarship papers, then at Patricia's earnest face, and finally at Antonio's encouraging smile. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say yes," Richard urged. "Your talent deserves this chance." Patricia spoke up again, her voice softer than before. "Consider it karma. My attempt to humiliate you turned into something beautiful. Let me help make it even more meaningful." James thought about his father, who had worked extra jobs to buy their first piano. He thought about the years of practice, the competitions, the joy music had always brought him. And he thought about how a cruel joke had somehow opened the door to his dreams again. Finally, he nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "To all of it." The room seemed to exhale collectively. Richard began explaining the scholarship details, Antonio discussed performance schedules, and Patricia wrote out the first check for the scholarship fund. As they worked out the details, the sounds of the restaurant filtered through the door. Clinking glasses, quiet conversations, and the gentle buzz of a busy evening. But now these sounds held new meaning for James. This wasn't just his workplace anymore, it was where his life had changed course. Marcus, who had been quietly watching from the corner, stepped forward. "Well, Mr. Chen, I suppose I'll need to adjust the serving schedule." He smiled warmly. "Though I think we can all agree you're better suited to playing piano than carrying plates." Everyone laughed, and the remaining tension in the room dissolved. As they finished up the paperwork, James could hear the distant sound of the kitchen staff preparing for the dinner rush. But for him, everything had changed. The waiter's uniform he wore would soon be replaced by concert attire, and the weight of serving trays would give way to the touch of piano keys. Sometimes, he realized, life's greatest moments come disguised as its worst ones. 1 year later, the Golden Leaf was transformed. The restaurant had become famous not just for its excellent cuisine, but for its nightly musical performances. Tonight was special. It marked exactly 1 year since the evening that had changed everything. James Chen stood in the employee changing room, adjusting his bow tie. Instead of the waiter's uniform he had worn for so many months, he now wore a perfectly tailored black suit. His fingers, no longer carrying plates and glasses, were limber and ready for the evening's performance. The restaurant was fully booked. Word had spread that tonight's program would be extraordinary. Regular patrons who had witnessed the original night sat at their tables, sharing the story with newer guests. The famous Steinway grand piano gleamed under the chandelier lights, freshly polished for the occasion. Antonio Romano walked through the dining room, personally greeting guests. The past year had been the most successful in the restaurant's history. The combination of fine dining and world-class music had created something unique in New York's culinary scene. Near the piano, a brass plaque had been installed. The James Chen Music Scholarship Fund, supporting tomorrow's musicians. In its first year, the fund had already helped 5 talented students pursue their musical dreams. Patricia Wellington's initial donation had inspired others, and the fund had grown beyond anyone's expectations. James peeked through the kitchen doors, just as he used to do during his serving days. The staff greeted him warmly. He was still family to them, even though he now spent his time at the piano instead of carrying orders. The chef gave him a thumbs up, and several servers wished him luck. At precisely 8:00 p.m., Antonio stepped onto the small stage area near the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "1 year ago tonight, something magical happened in this room. Tonight, we celebrate not just music, the power of second chances." James walked to the piano amid enthusiastic applause. As he sat down, he noticed Patricia Wellington sitting quietly at a corner table. She looked different now, softer somehow, more genuine. The past year had changed her too. She had become one of the city's most prominent supporters of young musicians. Before beginning, James spoke to the audience. "I'd like to start with the piece that changed my life here last year." His fingers found their position on the keys, and the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne No. 20 in C-sharp minor filled the room. As he played, memories of that fateful night flooded back, but now they carried no pain, only gratitude for the strange way life sometimes works. His fingers danced across the keys with even more skill than before. A year of dedicated practice and study at Manhattan School of Music had further refined his talent. In the audience, several of his former professors from the music school watched proudly. His graduation recital had been a sensation, and he was already receiving offers to perform at venues across the country. But he always made time for his 3 nights a week at the Golden Leaf. This was home. The kitchen staff paused their work to listen, just as they had done a year ago. But now they wore proud smiles, knowing they had witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. Marcus Reynolds, still the restaurant manager, stood near the kitchen, remembering how close they had come to missing this talent. As the final notes of the piece faded away, Patricia Wellington was the first to stand for the ovation. Tears glistened in her eyes as she applauded. Her attempt at humiliation had transformed into one of the most meaningful actions of her life. James moved seamlessly into other pieces, each one telling part of his story. The music soared through the restaurant, touching everyone in the room. Regular patrons who had witnessed his journey over the past year smiled knowingly at new guests, sharing whispered versions of the story. Later that evening, after the final encore, James stood to address the crowd one last time. "They say music has the power to change lives," he said. "A year ago, I discovered it also has the power to change hearts." He glanced at Patricia, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. As the applause finally died down and guests began to leave, James remained at the piano, gently touching the keys. From humiliated waiter to celebrated pianist, from broken dreams to new beginnings, the journey had been extraordinary. But perhaps the most beautiful part was knowing that his story had inspired others to pursue their own dreams, proving that sometimes the most magical transformations begin with the darkest moments. The Golden Leaf had become more than a restaurant. It was now a place where dreams could come true, one note at a time,